Ready to go!
That's a tasty platter. Hey YouTube, how you doing? Topic for tonight is something different. Been doing a lot of thinking lately. A lot of things to think about. And the thing I've been thinking about is arm wrestling. Surprise, surprise. To give you an update and some context, that's really where my thinking was on all this. Recently I became friends. I haven't actually met the guy yet in person, but I became friends with a gentleman through Lachlan Adair named Bella Gee. I don't even know if that's how I say his name or if that's just his Facebook name or what. But anyway, Bella, let's just call him Bella from here on in. Bella is a world level Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu athlete. I think he's been right to the pointy end of world rankings. And Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu as a study has been more tried and tested than arm wrestling. Sheer fact that there's more money through mixed martial arts, and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is a big part of mixed martial arts. More people have spent time thinking about how to perfect that sport, that art, that combat skill, whatever view you want to look at it. And Bella has now become interested in arm wrestling. And he's a novice. He hasn't even yet got on the table with anyone. But he's been dedicated to thinking about the sport for about 6 months now. And he's been training and working with myself and Lachlan Adair quite a lot. And introducing Lachlan and I to a lot of the thought patterns and principles that he learned in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and is now, through discussions with myself and Lachlan, bringing out some really interesting thoughts that I think will further the sport. I really do. I think not just for myself and Lachlan, but I think potentially this could unlock a way of thinking for the entire sport. And now, what I'm about to talk about is rather a simplification of the sport. In a physical sense, I'm going to break down the sport of arm wrestling into stages. Objectives, call them key events that in every arm wrestle you really need to secure before you gain victory. I've broken arm wrestling down into 4 steps, and it's largely based on a similar process, similar way of thinking that Bella showed me, that the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu world breaks down its sport into 4 steps. Anyway, the 4 steps, what are they? The first step was really to secure your hand and wrist in a position where you know that if you apply any further, let's call it finishing power, be it side pressure, down pressure, where if you apply any further finishing force, that you're not going to lose your hand in any way, shape, or form. We all know what that feels like. We know what it feels like to have a half-hearted kind of vulnerable hand position. When you drive sideways, if you lose your hand, it feels horrible. So objective number 1 is simply to secure your hand position. In any position, it could be wrist bent, it could be pronated, it could be wrist back and pronated. It could be wrist back and supinated. That is going to depend on the opponent specific that you're up against and your approach to that opponent. But you do need to secure your hand. You need to know that if you impart a finishing pressure, that your hand will stay secure. So objective number 1 in the sport of arm wrestling is to obtain a secure hand position, whatever that may be. Objective number 2 is to reduce your opponent's efficiency in respect to their hand position. Now, doing so will always reduce their ability to apply finishing pressure. So we're talking about taking away their pronation, taking away their wrist flexion, taking away their rotation of their hand in particular, and their forearm on the plane that our forearm does rotate. So step 2 is to aim to reduce your opponent's base of power within their hand control. Okay. Step 3 is to simply bring your opponent further away from their base of power in respect to their entire body. Now, to do that, obviously, we're just talking about bringing them to your side of the table. The further you can separate your opponent from their base of power, the weaker their finishing pressure is going to be, and the more vulnerable their hand will become once again. So step 3 is simply to bring them to your side of the table and disconnect them from their base of power. Now, step 4 and the final objective in arm wrestling is to simply apply side pressure or down pressure to finish the match and gain victory. Side pressure, down pressure, the two only forces that will obtain you a victory. Back pressure doesn't obtain you a victory, it simply creates an opportunity for you to obtain victory. So either side pressure or down pressure is going to be used one way or the other to finish the match. Now, you got to ask yourself, why break the sport up into these 4 objectives? What it really gives us the opportunity to do is to think about the sport more. The more we understand what it is we're doing, what it is we're attempting to exert over our opponents, the more specifically we can analyze the movements involved, and more specifically, can we prepare appropriate training? A lot of people train for arm wrestling in a very generic sense. A lot of people say there's just tens of thousands of reps required on the table, and no one really breaks down the sport. I know Devin Larratt will talk about the fundamentals of the sport being wrist flexion, pronation, back pressure, side pressure, and that's true, they are the fundamentals of the sport, but no one really breaks the sport down into stages of how to achieve victory. So this is kind of the rough edit, but I feel like those 4 steps are essentially the pathway to victory for any one given match. And when you are coming into a tournament, or when you are coming up against a specific super match opponent, you can now program training specifically to each phase of the sport. One of the most important things is to reflect on your own abilities as an arm wrestler. When you're preparing for a match, you have an intuition that tells you where your weakness is. It might be gaining hand control. It might be denying them from hand control. It might be bringing them your side of the table, or you might simply lack the finishing power. Breaking the sport down into these 4 stages is going to help you identify where your weakness is and where your biggest vulnerabilities are for the upcoming match, and subsequently allow you to program training specifically to that stage. Now, as you can imagine, programming for stage 1 is largely going to be strict start wrist flexion, strict start pronation, strict start wrist rise, strict start chop, all those sorts of things. Okay. In terms of step number 2, it's going to be imparting an active pressure from a dynamic movement, again, on all those same things: wrist flexion, pronation, supination, wrist rise, chop, because it's about taking things away. So how you would prepare for stage 1 versus stage 2 is very different. Stage 1 is going to be strict and static in its nature. Stage 2 is going to be dynamic and active in its nature. If stage 3 is where you've identified your weakness, i.e. bringing your opponent to your side of the table, you're going to be working on back pressure, you're going to be working on lat pressure, you're going to be working on rear delt pressure. All of those styles, you're going to be working on pec pressure. All those things are going to bring your opponent closer to you and separate them from their arm. And then stage 4, finishing pressure, you're probably going to work on your inner elbow or your shoulder in order to be able to impart that final overwhelming force. Yeah, so when I think about it, like I said, this is very new. This is all very new way of thinking. But one thing for sure that I love about this sport is that it is not just a strength sport. It really is a combat sport. And because it's a combat sport, and it's a human against another human, there's so many more variables than I think a lot of people appreciate. And I think that if you ever limit yourself to the thought that it is simply a strength sport, you really do make yourself vulnerable to an opponent who outthinks you. At the end of the day, the weaker man can win in this sport. It's happened many times. I've felt it many times on the table. I've been the weaker man, yet I've been able to obtain victory because I've outthought my opponent and I've applied better pressures on better vectors at better times. And this thought process will allow us to, I think, go deeper into that rabbit hole of combat skills for this sport. And I would like to invite you all into the conversation of thought regarding this, because the more minds that are thinking this way, the greater our sport's going to become. And the more athletes we get involved in the sport, it's going to only reward us all. All ships rise with the tide. Never think that helping another opponent or helping another athlete or helping another content creator, never think that that is going to be a detriment to you. I firmly believe that all ships rise with the tide, meaning that I am always willing to, and I encourage you all to share as much information as possible when it comes to anything that feels and seems successful in your training. And for me, this feels really successful in training. I feel like this is going to unlock a lot of very effective and specific training. Anyway, that's it. That's the thoughts. Now we get back to what really matters. Look at this plate. Look at this. I'm trying to remember what this is called. Hang on. Without asking my... Tzatziki, my fiance has answered it. Thank you, Joanne. Anyway, guys, I'm going to go enjoy some tzatziki and some amazing platters. And we're going to go watch a Christmas movie. And I hope whilst I'm doing that, you're all thinking about arm wrestling and the 4 stages of arm wrestling. All right, see ya.
Yes, that's a man!